In the future, driving is going to look a whole lot different than it does today. One of the people shaping that future is Ryan Powell, head of UX design at Waymo, Google's self-driving car project.
When you don't have a human driver, you have to establish trust between the technology and the passenger.
Welcome to the Method Podcast, where we explore the design stories behind Google products and experiences. I'm Travis Nielsen, your new host, taking over from Aidan Simpson. Before Aidan left, he hopped in a car with Ryan to hear a little bit more about what it means to design interfaces for our self-driving future.
Okay, everybody have their seatbelts buckled?
Ready to go.
Aidan, I'll let you do the honors.
Okay.
You can hit the start ride button up there.
Okay.
Auto driving.
Perfect. And we're off.
And we're off. The car is driving itself officially.
Maybe to just get started, could you tell us your name and what project you work on?
Sure. I'm Ryan Powell, and I lead up the UX design team here at Waymo. We are a team of about 5 designers at the moment. And we all were actually at Google before we made the move over to Waymo.
We are sitting in a Chrysler Pacifica.
Yes.
That is the car that you guys use as the testing vehicles. And you and I are sitting in the back, and we have a safety driver in the front.
Safety driver, yeah.
Yeah. And in front of us, we have a fairly large screen that is displaying a bunch of information to us about the route that we're taking and also some of the road conditions.
That's exactly right. On the design team, we break up this interface into sort of 2 main parts. We have this 3D scene that you see here, and you can see the Pacifica is in the center of this screen. You can see the vehicles that are making a left turn in front of us. They're on the screen as well. We use these simple shapes to render the traffic, but when it comes to cyclists and pedestrians, we actually use the laser points to represent them. And what's cool about that is you can see their arms and legs move.
Is there a particular reason why you choose to render pedestrians and even cyclists, I've noticed, in that more detailed way, whereas I'm looking at the cars and they're blue rectangles with a lighter blue halo around them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I joined the team, we actually were using the laser points to render the nearby traffic as well. But because of the way that the hardware is set up, you don't get a full 360-degree representation of that object in the UI when you just rely on that piece of data. And so what we've done is we know that object, of course, is a car or is a truck. And so we created our own shape to take the place of that raw data. Because when I joined the team as sort of somebody kind of new coming into it, the vehicles and the traffic, it all sort of looked half rendered when we would look at it, just because of the way all the hardware is set up. And so I was concerned back then that somebody might look at the UI and think that it was maybe not working correctly by seeing these things that are half rendered. And so that's why we've gone to the full shapes for the cars. But we don't have that issue when it comes to pedestrians and cyclists. There aren't as many occlusions that are happening. That's why you'd see some of this partial rendering.
And I also noticed a cyclist just drove in front of us at this intersection, and he had a light blue halo, and there's a pedestrian also going across the crosswalk, and they have a white halo underneath them. What's the reason for the difference there?
Reason for that subtle difference is, again, it's a subtle way of showing off our technology and the fact that we can recognize the difference between a pedestrian and a cyclist.
What is the hardest thing about working on Waymo?
We don't often have a lot of reference models to look at in the real world where you have a similar service or product that's out there with people interacting with it. So we're having to really draw from a lot of the experience that we've had as designers on the consumer products that we've worked on. We try to bring that experience forward into this context.
Are there any other autopilot systems on planes or anything like that you've used to inform your initial design language?
That's a good question. Maybe not so much our design language, but more about the larger user experience. We sometimes think about the experience of being a passenger or a rider when you're in a plane, and what type of information do you need to know on that trip. So of course you understand that the plane is at a certain altitude and it's traveling at a certain speed, but plane travel is so commonplace that you don't have to be that transparent with the passengers around every little thing that the airplane is doing, right? So when you think about the autopilot that's engaged, you can listen in sometime with your headset to what the pilots are saying and how they communicate with like the air traffic control towers, and you see some basic information on the screen about the speed, the direction, sort of where you're at in the journey. But I would say there isn't as much transparency. That's really the key thing that we focus on here, is that when you think about the lasers, the cameras and the radars that are part of the hardware set, we have to really peel away a lot of that data to present something to the user that is understandable and useful.
So what research informs the design work that your team does?
Earlier this year, we launched the Early Rider program in Phoenix. And so we have people that are using our service to do things like go to work, go to school, go to the mall on the weekends. And that's really the basis of where we are learning a lot about how people interact with self-driving cars. And so through that program, we have an awesome user research team that, of course, we're very close to. And so for every trip that somebody takes in the Early Rider program, they provide some feedback on that trip. Our researchers are out there talking to people. They often ride along with people in the cars. They survey them. It's a constant back and forth communication between the Waymo team here and what they're experiencing in Phoenix.
Was there any particular reason you chose Phoenix as the initial testing ground?
The reason is that Phoenix is a modern city, so infrastructure-wise, and think of the roads and everything, it's a good experience to drive on them. And when it comes to Arizona, the legislative environment is conducive to self-driving cars.
So when you're testing with these real users out in the field, what unique challenges are you finding with a new product and a new service like this?
What we've noticed is the transition or the shift that people have to make from being drivers to being passengers, and what that means to really allow Waymo to be the driver. So I think the big insight that we have is that when you don't have a human driver, you have to establish trust between the technology and the passenger. And when you're a passenger in a car with a human driver, there's a lot of communication that takes place between the passenger and that human driver. So you might notice the driver kind of shifting their hands on the steering wheel, which might be a signal that they're about to, make a left turn. Or you might notice that their gaze is watching a pedestrian cross the road, and so that's why we're not moving. And you might even ask somebody like, hey, why are we going this way? So there's this mix of verbal and nonverbal communication that happens, and I think there's some number out there that says more than half of all communication is nonverbal. And so when you don't have that human then in the driver's seat, how do you recreate that communication that takes place? As designers, we think a lot about that. So one of the benefits of being in a self-driving car is that it becomes your own space. It becomes your time to sort of unwind. We expect people to be on their phones, maybe just to kick back and gaze out the window and relax and have a few moments to themselves. And so there's a balance then, like how intrusive do we want to be when it comes to that space with what the car is seeing and what it's doing. So that's the fine line that we walk when we think about the interface that we see in front of us.
Do you think you can get less and less intrusive over time as people get more and more used to this as a method of transport?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's definitely a curve, right? From the beginning of the first trip to the end of the first trip, there's a curve that people climb up where they become more trusting of the technology. And that's one of the things that's really actually exciting to see. Our research team just came back and we did a round of research with some participants where they got to go into the cars and they were, of course, driving themselves. There was nobody in the front seats. And we shot video of them getting out of the car for the first time. And it really is almost like they've come out of this really cool experience, and the looks on their faces and just the things that they say, it's like they've met the future and they believe in it now. And they got to experience that. And so it's really cool to see that.
Can we talk about the experience that people are having in Phoenix right now and any interesting findings from your early testing? You've mentioned to me previously that it's a curbside pickup service.
Yep, exactly. So we would call it transportation as a service, and what happens in Phoenix is that a user can let the car know where to pick it up and then where they want to go. And like I mentioned, we have people doing that every day, whether it be going to work, going to home. One of the things that we have found from that research that's really interesting is that when you're a passenger and you're waiting for a vehicle to come pick you up, there are some complexities there that are really interesting. So when you tell a car where to pick you up, you're sending that car a specific location. And so when it arrives to that location, it might need to make some adjustments depending on what's happening in the real world. What we've noticed is sometimes if you're in, say, in a parking lot at a shopping mall, you might make eye contact with the car as it's approaching you, and you sort of walk up to it. But what the car is trying to do is it's trying to get to that location that might be 50 feet away from where you're standing, because it knows that is the pickup location.
Are there any other main insights that you've learned from observing these riders?
I think one of the things that we're still learning about is the way the information that you see here on the screen that's in front of us. You have this 3D scene where we're trying to show you what the vehicle is seeing around it. And you can see, for example, we have this pedestrian that's in front of us. We're using the laser points to render that pedestrian because it's really cool to see their arms and legs move. And that's in contrast to some of the things that we're doing here with the cars, where they're more simple shapes. And so the big insight is just going back to that idea of how much is too much information. And what we found is that so far we're striking a good balance between what the car is seeing and what it's thinking and what it's doing, and the amount of information that we are showing on the screen. What we think a lot about too is that you notice here on the interface that we're on Castro Street, we're in a 25 mile an hour zone. This 2D layer is really meant to be sort of a status layer. It's meant to be kind of at a glance information that the user can glance up and take a look at to get a sense of where they're at. As we approach this red light, for example, we have the traffic light that's indicated here. You can see that it's a red light. But there are moments where we want to be a bit more direct with some of the messaging that's happening. So if we have a message that comes on screen and we choose to also augment that with some sound in the car, that's really a signal to the user to look up from what they're doing. It's a little bit more intrusive. And so we're fine-tuning some of those details based on the research we're doing from the early rider program, where just how much do people want to be notified and alerted to things versus how much of it can be a little bit more passive and just available when you need it.
I guess these are all honing in on you as designers building in ways that riders understand what's happening on the screen, but also understanding that they can trust this car and this car knows exactly what's going on.
Right. I see this interface really as a proxy for a human driver that would be in the car, and whether it be more direct communication, like some of our messaging that comes up on the screen, or more indirect things like the different colors between the cyclists and the pedestrians. That's the type of communication that we're trying to recreate with our technology in order to foster that trust.
We discussed nonverbal communications a little bit earlier, so that could be things like the driver turning the indicator on or moving their head to look around to the left-hand side. Are there any other design details that you guys are putting into the system to represent those nonverbal communication styles in the interface?
We spend a lot of time thinking about the 3D scene, and so an example of that would be the buildings that you see in here. We're bringing that in from the maps data that we have, and we dim them back because they're not as critical to the driving experience, but we provide them for more context to the riders. So that's maybe one example, but we're constantly looking at that 3D scene and looking at that long list of all of the things that we could show and trying to filter down to what really makes the most sense for users. Small examples too, like one little magic moment that always happens when I give folks a ride is if we go by a traffic cone and you see it in the interface here in the screen, and for some reason people just think that's the coolest thing, that the car is that smart that it's able to pick up and able to see like, oh, that's actually 3 traffic cones, and you see the little cones here in the interface. We put that feature in a while ago, and it's one of those things that surprised us at how sort of been a big ROI. It was fairly easy for us to do, but people just are really impressed by that.
It was a nice bit of user delight that you got without even thinking about it.
Exactly. And what's cool about it is you don't realize how many traffic cones are actually off on the side of the road until you actually start to drive around in one of our vehicles and you start to notice them on the screen.
Yeah. You mentioned that the car is receiving a lot of data from all the different sensors around it. How do you make that understandable?
Yeah, it's actually through a lot of experimentation. What's nice about, I think, the way that Waymo works, and specifically, so my team and then the engineers that we work closely with, is we all sit very close together and we're able to try ideas, get something into the vehicle on a weekly basis. We're able to get out and just hop in the car right outside the door and go for a test drive and try something out. So it's a lot of adjusting, getting in the car, experiencing it in the real world, going back to our desks, making some adjustments, and then getting back out in the car and seeing how it works. And so I've talked to other designers that are at competing companies, and one of the things that they, I think, are always in awe about with Waymo is that it's really a luxury for us to be able to just hop into a car like we did today and go try something out and then get back to our desks
Temporary
and
stop sign.
continue to work on something.
Is there anything interesting that you learnt when finding a balance between trust and too much information?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a fine line between providing the user with just the right amount of information versus overloading them or being too intrusive. And so I think I mentioned earlier that we think a lot about when we should try to draw your attention out of what you're doing in the car versus providing some ambient information for you that's available in case you glance up and want to see something.
I just noticed a good example of that. You don't display the red traffic light icons on screen until you come within range of a traffic light.
Exactly. Even though the cars can see 360 degrees around them, they can see 3 football fields away. You're right. We don't show that traffic light until we get there. What's interesting here, too, is we just had a bunch of cyclists go in front of us. We have the crossing guard holding up the temporary stop sign. When we go by, if that guard was to hold the stop sign up for us, then you would see that in the UI as well. But what's cool, I think, here is that a bunch of kids just got out of school, and so you can see them here at the crosswalk. You can see them rendered with the laser points. We have one on a bike. We have a couple that are about ready to cross through the crosswalk here.
The stop sign just appeared on the screen as well there.
Yeah, he's the stop sign that the crossing guard is holding up. But what's cool about that is that, you know, on the right of us too, there's another stop sign, but that one isn't relevant to the car's path right now. And so we're smart enough to say, like, there was a stop sign to our right, but it had nothing to do with the flow of traffic that we were in. But the stop sign that the crossing guard had up did. And so we are able to understand that context and to show the right cue.
So it's all about helping the riders understand exactly what the car is doing in that exact moment. And all these little details add up to giving the rider a sense of trust.
Right.
I want to talk a bit about your design process. Where do you start when designing a self-driving car experience?
At the heart of it, it is a consumer product. And so I mentioned before that everybody on the design team has a significant amount of experience designing a variety of consumer products. And so I think we draw on our experience as designers in that regard. I think what we also do is we definitely look at what's happening in the auto industry around HMI, that's the human machine interface. Those UIs are usually optimized for a driver, but there are some things in there that we certainly pay attention to. The fact that when you're in the car, those UIs understand the difference between daytime and nighttime. And so just little things about eye fatigue and readability at a certain distance, we certainly pay attention to all of those heuristics, and we bring that into our work. We constantly have to remind ourselves, though, that our consumers are passengers, and so the experience there with this interface is definitely a little bit different than if you were a driver.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the status layer earlier, and we've discussed all the information that riders need to see. What are some use cases where proactive communication like that may be helpful?
It's about 4 o'clock in Mountain View on a Friday afternoon, so you can see traffic is starting to get pretty heavy. And just like a human driver, we might want to make a right turn up here, but because of the heavy traffic, we might not be able to get over in the lane to make that turn in time. And so that would be a case where, hey, if we miss a turn and we also notice that it might add a little bit more time to your trip, we would bring your attention to that and be a little bit more interruptive with how we do that versus passive.
How are you uncovering those moments of confusion and helping the user understand what's going on?
So the way that we are getting a sense of what might feel weird to a user versus a little bit more normal is really all the research that we're getting out of the early rider program in Phoenix. And so because we have riders interacting with our vehicles on a daily basis, that's where we're learning all these great insights around, like, oh, this situation actually is one where we need to be a little bit more proactive in the communication. So I mentioned before the example of missing a lane change and then having to update the route that you're taking to your destination. That's one where we're a little bit more proactive on the screen. We use a little bit of audio to draw your attention to the UI to let you know about that route change. Another example might be one where an emergency vehicle is trying to pass by us and we want to move over to the right to yield to that vehicle. That's something, again, on the screen where we'll render the emergency vehicle with the flashing lights. We'll have a message on the screen that says we're yielding to the emergency vehicle. And again, that's the type of thing that we've found that can be a little bit of an anxious moment for people when there's an emergency vehicle and they're in a self-driving car. But you are reassured that the car knows what it's doing when you understand first and foremost that it knows that that's an emergency vehicle. And then we actually have the messaging that's very explicit about the fact that we're yielding to that emergency vehicle.
So any driving time when a human driver would feel stress, you can really use this status layer to build trust and help them understand that the car knows exactly what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, construction zones would maybe be another example where we've learned that, again, whether it's a construction zone, it's temporarily changed the road conditions, and as a passenger, you might wonder, like, oh, does a self-driving car understand what's happening in this situation? And so again, that's why in the interface that we have here in front of us, we show that construction zone, and you can see, like, if there's a construction worker showing a temporary stop sign, we even show that in the UI as well.
All right, so I like to ask a couple of rapid-fire questions at the end, which is more about you.
Okay.
What's the best advice you've been given?
The best advice I've been given is not to tell people about an idea, but to show them. And I think as designers, that's what we are uniquely positioned to do, that we can give form to ideas and we can bring them to life. And I think that's what gets people really excited about something. And I think as designers, there are different ways to do that. You can do that at a very high fidelity, or you can kind of go into like a movie trailer level of detail where it's enough to make somebody really want to continue that project or go in that direction or realize that vision. And I think only designers can do that.
What's your dream car?
My dream car, I would say, I think maybe this is obvious, but dream car would be
Chrysler Pacifica?
Not Chrysler Pacifica, although it is a great car. It really is. If I had a family, this would be the car that I would definitely get. But my dream car would be Kit from Knight Rider. As a kid, I was, of course, like super into the show, and I would pretend that my bicycle was Kit. And so, this car that can drive itself, it can talk to you, it can do all of these things, right? So maybe I've come full circle in a way.
It sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, now that I'm at Waymo.
Okay, awesome. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. This has been great.
Thanks, Aidan.
As always, you can find more information on the things we talked about in the show notes at design.google/podcasts. This episode was recorded and edited by Brian Gordon and produced by Barbara Eldridge. The artwork you see for each episode is created by Skip Hirsch, and scheduling is handled by Becca Tollefson. Subscribe to the show on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like this episode, please leave a review. It really helps new listeners find the show. Okay, that's it from us.